I just noticed.
Thanks, Kira.
All right.
Yeah, apologies for those coming in now on the recording. And I will pick up with that. I'll catch that up a bit later. Thanks for that. Yes, so what we're going to get, other examples. So we're talking here about structural racism and some of the institutions and how they work. I need to keep my eye on time.
What about like World Trade Organization, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. In what way, Kathy? How does that work?
Well, it's come about with the neoliberal policies, and I was looking at it this morning with the coffee farmers and that sort of thing. So their structure is designed and more or less implemented by the World Trade Organization, which is quite dominated by the developed countries, and then you have the structural adjustment programs that South African nations are under, and so they can't have subsidies for the farmers, and it's kind of like a hangover from the colonial days, so they're still exerting power and not being listened to. You know, the African people are not being listened to, and their needs, and to make it a fairer marketplace. So it's like that dismissiveness of knowledge, depending on race, sort of thing. Like they're just sort of told this is how it's going to be. And
reinforcement of reinforcement of poverty. Anybody else want to just add something into that?
I think the healthcare system as well, how certain communities are disadvantaged in terms of access to medical care. Looking at the COVID-19 situation, especially in America, certain African American communities or Latin American communities are suffering more in terms of higher rates of COVID-19 because there's kind of a fear associated with seeking medical help.
Yeah, and actually being able to access it in the first place, given how the healthcare system works there. People living in remote places can really struggle in a place like Australia and the US and Canada and anywhere in the world. In fact, that can become a problem for them. Yep. Yeah, and then once inside the hospital, they can encounter all sorts of ways in which their needs are dismissed, ignored. So we've been seeing some of that recently, I think, with discussion of Indigenous prisoners as they meet the hospital system as well. So some of the deaths in custody issues pick that up. My particular area, of course, is schooling, and we can see the various ways in which schools professes a meritocratic system and helps reinforce a sense that if you're good enough, you can do well in this school system. But of course, there are all sorts of barriers for people in minorities groups to actually access. I mean, language can be one, another can be a whole other sort of systemic family set of issues. You're looking in somewhere like Australia, the undermining of the structural, the systematic destruction of family life of Aboriginal people in this country. That's a part of the historical legacy. That actually also people were not allowed to go to school. They just weren't welcome in normal school systems for a good many years. So you've got parents who haven't got that experience of formal education, and without that experience, it's very difficult for that to then be passed on generationally, and that remains. So this is an ongoing issue. It's getting addressed slowly, but it is slowly. I mean, it seems to me to be one of the issues around closing the gap. And then, of course, within the schools themselves, the ways in which systems are not well adapted to people with different needs. I can think of Cambodian students I saw in the school I did my research in, and how they could not get access to English as second language assistance when students who'd arrived from Malaysia 3 years earlier could, because they'd only been in the country for a certain period of time. These Malaysian students spoke English almost as a first language. The Cambodian students never spoke English at home. You get those kinds of systems that come into play that operate in also, that just help keep, well, it's not necessarily even deliberate, but those systems keep people in their place.
I'm not wrong. Even the fact that in some school didn't allow for people to wear hair in a specific way, in some countries you're not allowed. It's not well tolerated if you have like maybe Muslim.
Yeah, so those forms
male.
of cultural expression, and which are born often sometimes out of need. There's been a story coming out recently. I noticed a young lad who's been challenging some of the views around hair and racial the ways in which straight white hair, dare I call it that, gets institutionalized in places like that and just keeps people in their place. Let's not get too much further lost in that. There's structural racism, gets enacted, as Roberta was pointing out earlier. It gets those institutional racism is enacted at the global system. I think that Kathy has already given us some leads in regards to the ways in which these systems have shifted from a colonial mode of operating into new modes of operating, but that still look to be favouring particular nations, particular blocks of nations, which also has look an awful lot like the places that used to be the colonising nations, and there's an awful coincidence with those that will form colonies, who still seem to be in many instances, not in all, but in extreme poverty in many instances, and the ways in which we've got then we can look historically at some of the shifts that have taken place and see how it's shifted from the national to the global level, something like the World Trade Organization, and the ways in which that has acted in ways that still seem to be keeping people in their place. Mm-hmm. Okay, anything else then so Christian's model is taking those institutional forms, putting them into that wider stage, and I think Kathy's given us a great lead in thinking about one of the ways in which that acts. Because what we do with the United Nations is an interesting question in all of that, but I don't think we should get too lost in that. We've got some case studies to work with, and I want to get you working with them soon enough. What are some of the problems with this particular model? With this sort of modelling, I mean, just generally, but you might want to also get to specifics of it.
I definitely think it fails to adequately account for intersectionality
Right.
in terms of using race as the core framework.
Yep.
But then again, I do think it's quite reasonable to say that, you know, a poor black woman has more in common with a poor black man than she does with a poor black white woman, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that it doesn't really, the framework doesn't necessarily allow for gradations in there,
mm-hmm.
in terms of where intersectionality might exist within a person's own lived experiences, but where experiences that two different people or two different individuals or two different groups of people, generally speaking, might have things in common, even though their lived experiences aren't necessarily obviously exactly the same.
Yep.
I think that's probably my biggest criticism of the framework.
So a form of racial determinism, but also, yes, it doesn't allow for the nuances of
yeah, I definitely don't think it takes into account enough of the gender and class disparity that exists and that drives a lot of the social structural problems that we have.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yep. And see, I mean, that is acknowledged by Christian towards the end of her paper, but of course she is presenting in some ways a polemic around this, isn't she? She's presenting us with something to work with and then off, and I think that's what's also important to acknowledge in this. Yep. Any other thoughts? Any other problems?
The way she doesn't take into consideration the resistance that can be acted against these structural racism models in some countries that are actually resisting and coming with a strong reaction, opposite reaction to that, which is given rise to popularism and nationalism in some countries in actually scary ways, I'd say.
Yep. And that could also be another kind of flip side about it can present people of color as victims of systems and not recognize firstly how they're not simply that, But then, of course, also how people of colour can also be involved in their own forms of oppression in their own places and times as well. So I think these are elements of this kind of essentializing. I mean, they can get down to essential elements if it doesn't allow for the exceptions and the variations within. Go on, Rebecca.
One other thought that I have is also she doesn't account of the ways in which people of color are using the fact that they are people of color to kind of affirm their difference, but in a positive way. They feel like they are united. They use that as a powerful tool rather than seeing that as a problem. Some of them that they're trying to frame it differently, basically.
Yeah, and I think something that I've talked about in class, and so it's worth getting out into the more general setting here, and thank goodness I am recording this, but I've also spoken about the ways in which it comes down again to things about seeing always the problems of the world. And I think the music examples we've tapped into, we can certainly fit this, you can fit, global metal into it. You've got multinational corporations cynically spreading global, just spreading metal across and bringing people in different ways. But the fact about it is that the people are responding creatively, in many instances, really creatively to some of the forces. Going and seeing, they don't see it. It's not oppressive force. It's not that at all. It's a creative force in their life. It's life-giving in many instances as well. So it's not just about a world system. That even though if we think about global metal, it's a lot of white males who are at the centre of much of the powerful centres of that. At the same time, what people are doing with these things, with this particular, these efflorescences in different places, just complicates the picture so much. And if you're continually seeing it through a white supremacist, a black oppression sort of lens, you really will miss the creativity that is also at play in all of this. So, I mean, resistance is one way to see it. And I've mentioned also in class that critical thinkers tend to see agency as resistance and compliance as being just another example of where the structures are doing us over. I would say that compliance is also agency. Sometimes it's much better to get along with the system and do what you can and work it in your own way. And so it can fail to recognize, I think, some of those elements. And something else I've pointed to that's but that may be worth bringing into play, the teleological drive. I'll put that up as a note in a moment. Teleology, driving to a particular endpoint. So you've got this idea in mind and you just keep driving. You just keep fitting everything into it. And it just doesn't quite work. And I think that perhaps music examples probably more readily lend themselves to that, to allow us to explore that nuance. Thoughts, comments, responses? All right, I've put up another couple of. Another key concept: processes through which people located in vulnerable sectors of the economy are able to gain access to global wealth that otherwise would never reach them. What's that? What's being captured there?
Can you say it again, please?
Processes through which people, it's in the chat area, if you could read it. Processes through which people located in vulnerable sectors of the economy are able to gain access to global wealth that otherwise would never reach them.
I actually can't see that in the chat. Sorry, Martin.
Oh, can't you? From me to everyone, it should be there. Okay.
Was that Southern Agency, Martin?
No. For it to be Southern, it would have to have an element of the ways in which former colonies the Southern Agency idea is picking up the notion that these former colonies have particular characteristics. I think I might even be coming to it, Kathy. So, no, if you can't read it, that makes it hard. I agree. Trying to hear that. Gaining access to global wealth, otherwise never reach them. Globalization from below is part of what that's what that's trying to pick up, is that people are still able to access these sources, which is coming. I'm going to blank on the Brazilian scholar's name, his idea. gets picked up on there in the paper about the corn growers in Mexico. Cultural flows and disjunctures, who's that normally attributed to? Should almost be able to go automatic with that one.
Padurai?
That's a Padurai. Yeah, can you spell it?
A Padurai? I think so.
I'm just asking, right? I'm just asking. If you're going to use somebody's name, you should try and spell it properly, that's all. And he's one of the people, if you think about the cultural capital that you need to display as students in a unit like this, his name should flow pretty quickly, you know, and some of his ideas should really flow, dare I use that metaphor even, to pick that up. But you should be able to spell his name as well, if you're going to do it anyway. If you are going to name drop, make sure you do it as well as you can. And you know, these things, they're small things, but they do help establish your authority. Sorry, I thought I did have the Southern Agency one there, but no. Now, what sort of idea is this one picking up? Now, this one you may not recognise as readily. We've not emphasised it, but agency as so much. Agency is always structured. Structures are always agented. What
that was
sort of
Bourdieu's theory, wasn't it?
It's a Bourdieuian view, yeah. It is, and do you know what sort of theoretical frame is often attributed to Bourdieu? Yep, Natalie, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say practice. I think I was going to say Natalie beat me to
it. Very quietly putting it forward there in the notes. Yeah, that's practice theory. Yeah, so it's that the